Let's talk about Ventura
Alrighty.
and start from the beginning, as we usually do on these things. How'd you get started in the business, Lee?
I got to start a little bit before the beginning of Ventura to tell that story. After graduating from college in Dallas, I was interviewed, an on-campus interview with the guys at Xerox Office Products Division, and so went to work there and got exposed to the Xerox Star and the Alto and Smalltalk and all of the things that were going on there. And they were about ready to release a follow-on to the Xerox 820, which was their entry into the personal computer. It came out a couple.
Turn the mic towards you a little bit.
This one? Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
And so they had two versions. One was a 68,000 base follow-on, and then the other one, which was the 8086 base follow-on, it's called Early Bird. Early Bird eats the worm. The worm was the Xerox 820. And so we basically took the Star user interface and re-implemented just the appearance of it in something we called Lone Star because it wasn't networked, and it ran on this 8086 base PC. We hand-coded the Helvetica font that we had got from somewhere and got our own sort of bit-blit version of that. And that kind of got me into user interface. And my manager there ended up going to work at Digital Research in Pacific Grove for Gary Kildall, and they were doing CPM and the follow-ons to the CPM operating system. And so she recruited me to be their kind of graphics guy working on user interface. And so we converted that Lone Star idea into something called GEM, Graphic Environment Manager, which is a very small and fast desktop management system, as well as icons, dialogues, menus, all of the things that you need to build a graphical application. And then we built a suite of graphical applications on top of that: Gem Draw, Gem Graph, Gem Write, a whole slew of so that set of apps. And then we were sort of in a race with Windows, and VistaCorp had something called Vision, and so we were trying to do all of that. And it was about that time that I heard this story later directly from Bill Gates, because I had heard a rumor about this. And so we got a call from Apple saying that we think that Gem is too close to the Macintosh from a user interface point of view, because we had a trash can in the right-hand corner, and we had icons on the desktop and things that Steve didn't think had ever been done before anywhere else, but at Apple. At least that's the way the lawyers made it sound. And so. So what I heard from Bill was that Steve was not liking Windows coming out, and he had gone to complain to Bill Gates about Windows just before they were suing them. And Bill said, well, Gem is a lot closer to the Mac than Windows. Why don't you go talk to Gary at Digital Research and give him a hard time for a while, as kind of a delaying tactic, I think. And it worked. And so I remember sitting in a room with Jean-Louis Gassée, yep, and Guy Kawasaki, and a lawyer from Apple who had really big suspenders, and he spent his whole time with his hands kind of tucked into his suspenders. You guys may, yeah, exactly, or Rappaport. And so they were forcing us to make these changes. Digital Research wasn't as strong as Apple, and so we're going to have to make a bunch of changes to the user interface. So we were kind of upset with that idea, and there were two of us that wanted to do an application built on top of this, but we had to get out of Digital Research without with sort of permission to use Gem and without any sort of IP issues, conflict issues. And so we proposed doing, we didn't call it desktop publishing at the time, a high-end word processor was the word processor that could handle graphics was the way we described it. And we put a spec in place to say, hey, why don't you do this Digital Research? Because we wanted them to turn that down, so then we could leave Digital Research and say they had turned it down. We knew that at the time that we didn't really understand probably the full law, or we couldn't afford our own computers at home, but we knew we couldn't use any of the equipment there at Digital Research to write this software or to start working on it while we were still there. So we would just take long lunches and kind of talk through the data architecture and all the stuff that we were going to do as soon as we could start. And we finally got to the point where we could quit. And the one thing that we got from them was the right to use Gem, which was our windowing system.
Who's your partner?
So at the time, Don Heiskell, he was my manager. He ran the graphics group in Digital Research, and he was very much every little last bit and byte was kind of squeezed out of everything. He wrote almost everything in assembly language. I wrote mostly in C. And so he was really great at writing really super tight, fast code. And so together we would basically, I would write sort of, I'll talk about this in a minute, but anyway, we were at that point where it was becoming clear that digital research was going to cave on all this user interface stuff and not really, we wanted to do this app. And so we basically made the decision to leave. We raised, we had just gotten, I had just gotten a bonus of like $10,000 for getting Gem launched, which is a ton of money. My annual salary at that time was probably $25K or $35K or something like that. So that was a huge bonus for me. I didn't find out till later, but my manager, who was Don Heiskell, he had a $25K bonus. And then John Meyer, who was the third person in the team that we all left together, he also got a $25K bonus. So they could take cuts in salary to allow us to kind of get started, and I took a limited cut in salary. But we needed to raise, we were basically kind of like you guys in a way, we were going to pay everyone the exact same amount. We're going to each own, originally, 33% of the company each. And then we knew we needed some money to pay our salaries, even though we cut them to like $5K a month or whatever it was, or some number like that. And so we needed $100K. And so we raised, Don's family, parents didn't have any money that they could invest, but John's dad could invest, and my brothers and sisters and mom and dad could all invest. And so my side of the business got 45K of that, and John's side got 55K. And so we sold them 100K, well, we raised 100K and sold them 10% of the company. That was how we got our 6 months worth of runway, basically. And then, so that diluted us to each 30%, and that was the only money we ever raised in the company. We got to that 6-month point after we had started, and actually, I'll get to that story in a minute. But so anyway, that's how we got essentially out of digital research. We knew we had essentially 6 weeks from when we left there, started the company, to Comdex. And so John Meyer called all of the word processing companies that existed, all of the publishing companies he could think of, probably taking things out of the Siebold report, anyone that looked like they might be a licensee of what we were doing, because we knew OEM licensing, that's what digital research did with CPM operating system.
Give me the date you have.
So this is basically October of '85. And so he wrote letters, like 35 letters to all these different companies saying, hey, we're going to be at Comdex, come by our suite and see a demo of our software. And so Don and I had to sit down and write the software in the 6 weeks from there until we launched.
Stop you for a second.
Mm-hmm.
What were you trying to do with that software? What was the functional or the application?
The core idea was we had seen PageMaker, and we'd seen the success of PageMaker. And so we knew that we wanted to be able to do PageMaker-style documents, short documents. But we thought we had a better way than how PageMaker did it. And then we also, internally, we used Scribe as our system for doing tech manuals and all of those types of things. And so we understood about style sheets and the concept of, I think they called them components in Scribe, but basically a paragraph had a style, heading, subhead, byline, whatever it might be. And then you could assign type attributes to those style sheet tags. And so we thought that was a great idea. And so I had built the windowing management system in Gem, I thought of the page layout thing more like a window management problem. And so we said, instead of doing Paul's team at Aldus, the way they flowed type was very much replicated the sort of by hand way that it had worked in a newspaper. I'd never seen the by hand way when we were doing this. I had no concept. I'll explain my ignorance of typography in a minute. But anyway, I couldn't understand why do you have to grab the window shade here and then put it here and here and here, and it just seemed like, let's just let the computer flow it all. And so when you're doing a windowing system, the way in which I did it anyway was you sort of start from the lowest layer, that's the desktop layer, put a window on top of it, and that creates a clipping region for all the stuff that you don't have to draw. This window's on top and another window, and so when you're actually drawing the screen, everything is kind of clipped down below, so you're always drawing from a fixed display list, and you just draw the portion that the user can actually see, and that's how you simulate the layers on a desktop app. And what we had been doing in this 4 or 5 months when we were still at digital research, we knew we wanted to build something, and we knew we needed to support magazines, books, long document tech pubs, short document newsletters. And so every time we saw a piece of text or a layout technique that we had not seen before. We just tear that page out. I called it, we had this grocery bag full of type examples, basically of pages that we wanted to lay out to see if we could come up with the rules for the style sheet tags that would power all of that. So we learned a lot of things from that, like for instance, ruling lines. Ruling lines go with paragraphs, and if you have ruling lines above a paragraph and the paragraph moves down because something on the page above, those ruling lines have to move with it. That was a big problem with PageMaker. We said if we could do it better than PageMaker and faster and on the PC, then that was going to be that's how we sort of measured ourselves with respect to that. And so, yeah.
Next question. How did you, now you were going to use GEM as your platform, is that the right word, gentlemen?
Windowing system, yeah, platform,
Yeah.
sure.
And so how did you get that deal without running afoul of Apple or anybody?
Well, Apple is a different story, but with regard to digital research, who owned GEM, we had built it there and it's their software. We had to talk them out of letting us have a license. And what we ultimately convinced them of was that we're going to rebuild. We had two choices: rebuild one from scratch, because that one was about 64K. One of the things Bob said yesterday was so true. The amount of memory that we had to work with, was just not that much. So on the PC, we didn't want to run on Windows. Windows would have taken, first of all, it didn't really work that well at that period of time. Windows 1.0 was not really usable. But it was like 325K out of 640K was just to get Windows in. And then you had to build your app on top of that. And so it's just like, that's not going to work. So GEM at the time, the basic operating system kernel of GEM that handled all the UI part of it was about 64K. And I said, well, the part that we actually need for our app is about 24K. So I built a new version of GEM that was like 24K. And so now we had 24K versus 325K of Windows. So that was a massive memory advantage, footprint advantage that we had. And it gave us a window of time before larger teams of engineers could kind of come along with larger memory spaces and kind of just build what needs to be built.
You felt that would not be not screw up on the IP side then?
No, well, we got permission because they wanted us to write to the GEM API from Digital Research. Because if we wrote to the GEM API, even though it was our special trimmed down version, they thought, well, maybe there'll be more apps that come along that write to the GEM API and it'll build out. So they were willing to let us go. We offered them stock, but they didn't really want stock.
Okay, keep going.
Gary Kildall, by the way, I got to give him a lot of credit. He's a great guy and really, gave me enormous latitude in terms of the products that I got to work on at Digital Research, and was a good guy at this period of time. Even though he wasn't actively running the company, he probably still had sway on that. He also was able to get, ultimately, Steve Jobs to back off on the user interface stuff, because he and Steve had cut some deal, 5 years before that left that aside. So.
Right, so now 6 weeks you have to get your product.
Yeah, so we got to get our thing ready. So basically we make it, the core thing that we wanted to build that was different here was that we wanted to show in this suite at the Riviera at Comdex, we wanted to show to all the people that came in. John had them scheduled sort of out in this hallway basically, so we had them one after another. And the key three ones that really liked what they saw and got serious about bidding for it were Xerox, Kodak, and Micropro, which had WordStar at the time. And so we didn't really realize, although I had worked at Xerox, it didn't really occur to me, it wasn't like a plan. Xerox and Kodak are super rivals during all of this time period. And so they kind of got into a bidding war for what they saw. And what they saw was, one of the things that I view as our real innovations was in laying out a page, if you want to auto flow the text, what we did basically was, I called it rectangle breaking, but essentially you start with the base page, which is just one rectangle with one text file flowing into it. To make it be a 2-column page, you break that rectangle with another rectangle on top of it. That's essentially where the gutter is, right between the page. Now what was one rectangle becomes 2, and you know that they're linked in a certain order. And whenever you break one rectangle with another rectangle, you create a finite number of rectangles, and you know the order of flow of text. And when I look through all of this grocery bag full of examples, even like 6-column high-end newspaper published things, you could always have an ordering of those documents so that you would get the exact flow that you would get through this window shade method by this rectangle breaking technique. And so that allowed us to focus completely on that model of just flowing text from one rectangle to another and being as fast as we can on the line formatting, the J part of the H and J, basically the breaking the line. And that's the part that Don Heiskell wrote in very tight assembly language. Was I presented him basically with the paragraph, the offset into the paragraph, the XY location on the screen, and all the rules that would determine how, and the width table. He had to load the width table into memory as well to do all this stuff. So there's a lot of memory management going on to get that to go.
So did you ever write a business plan?
No. We might have written something kind of like a business plan when we tried to get Digital Research to say no to it. But that was not a very, we weren't very optimistic in our projections.
You didn't use it with your relatives to raise the money then?
No, the relatives, well, we figured, I've gone on to lose a lot of money from other investors. And, you know, my first law of fundraising is invest what you can afford to lose and have estate friends. And so that was the model I used with my family members as well, that we knew we could come home for Christmas. This wasn't their, you know, last dollars. And so, so it was very fun, though. My dad was really wise. I have to give him credit. My one brother didn't have $5,000 to put in for his share. And so my dad put the money in for him for that share because he wanted to have, when we were successful, if that happened, for all the siblings to kind of like have a good day on the same day. So I have to give him a lot of credit for the wisdom of that.
Okay, you have the three of you. How do you split up your roles?
So John Meyer was the company CEO, and he wrote the documentation. And then Don Heiskell did all the line formatting. He also did all the screen drivers, if we had new screen drivers for large displays. And he did some of the printer drivers, and he also did the word processing input-output file format converters. And then we hired another guy from Digital Research who would have been a founder, but he couldn't leave at the same time. That's John Grant. And he did the PostScript driver, and he did the equation editor when we eventually had that. And he kind of did all of the other pieces kind of in between, involved with some of the testing stuff as well. And then I wrote all the, basically the page formatter, and a huge challenge. We wouldn't have been able to do it without this. There was something called the Halcyon C compiler. There's a guy in Santa Cruz that did this, and that C compiler had an overlay manager. And so we worked in small model 8086, so all of the, so our addresses were all, you know, short addresses, basically 16 bits. And so it allowed us to, everything had to work in 64K, but then we could have an overlay manager and put the code in other chunks of memory and then bring them into that 164K block to execute out of. So whenever we needed a new feature, if it was in the critical path, the thing that where the code was most full, basically we had to move code around and redo the overlays to give ourselves room to add that new feature. The most important case of where that was a challenge was H and J. And from reading the Siebold reports, one of the benchmarks that they used for all systems was how fast could you do hyphenation justification of the Kennedy inaugural address. And so that was like the standard benchmark that we said, we're going to be measured by that. And so we were, it's like 2 or 3 days into starting the company when we actually were writing code, we're saying, okay, we got to load the file and we got to do this H and J and how we're going to do it. And we came up with the idea of not, the way it used to work, right, the way we thought most systems work, by the way it was described, was that you'd be basically formatting the line and you come to a word like impossible or whatever, and now you got to go out and call this dictionary in and figure out what the hyphen points are impossible, and then decide, okay, we'll pick that one and that'll be our break. And so that's a lot of thrashing back and forth to bring all that in. And so what we decided to do instead was when we loaded the file, we put in all possible hyphenation points as a special, so even though there's like essentially a special code in, so impossible would be IM and then a special code POM, so that we knew, so that the line breaking problem was now really easy. It's like all the words had extra spaces in them. They were all these hyphen options, and so that allowed us to take all of the hyphenation and do that at file load time. And then the justification part was a lot simpler then. So we finally, the first test that we did, we didn't have the file loading stuff, so we had one canned set of text in there, and we couldn't tell how fast we were. And so finally we got to the point where, you know, it's like 4 or 5 weeks in, and we started, the line formatting was working. It seemed like it was fast, but we couldn't really tell how fast. And so we finally got the file loading stuff into, so we could load something as long as the Kennedy inaugural into memory so we could test it. And then I'm like there with my stopwatch, and it's like, it's over, you know, it's like, I said, oh man, this is gonna be good. And so I had to load like 50 copies of the Canadian inaugural in and format all of that to kind of actually get a measurable thing. And at the time, a minute, 31 seconds, 21 seconds, 7 seconds was the fast that I'd ever seen in the Siebold report, and we were like sub 1 second times for formatting, for doing the H and J. So we thought, okay, this is fast enough now where maybe we can actually do editing, so. Yeah, that's how it felt. That's exactly how it felt. I remember standing in my kitchen calling Don. I said, Don, you're not gonna believe how fast we are. It's just totally that feeling. So.
See, go ahead.
The same questions I asked. Does this code survive? And then how long did you keep coding instead of becoming manager?
So Ventura survived. Ventura software as a company survived for 5 years. We went from 85 to 90. I heard a great term. I guess John mentioned it. Non-refundable advance against royalties, NAAR. That was a term that was in the first Xerox. We licensed the software to Xerox. That's what happened out of the Comdex demos that we did. And so we got to stay just ourselves as developers. There are 3 developers, one guy writing the documentation and being CEO. I'm just teasing John. And then an administrative assistant. You know, and so it was really a 5-person company. And so we just did software development through all of that time period. Eventually, Xerox wanted to buy. We had a number of very good renegotiations along the way. The first deal, I'll get into the business stuff in a minute, but to answer your question, in 1990, we sold, the last thing I worked on was porting it from Gem to Windows and to OS2 Presentation Manager, because Xerox was buying the software and they wanted the source code and they wanted it on these other platforms. There was a team that they were going to hire to do the Mac. And so we basically just, kind of like the core technology a little bit that John was referring to, we just remapped all the Gem calls into their equivalent on Windows and OS2. And in a couple weeks, we were up on those platforms, and that got us out of that. Eventually, Xerox sold it to Corel. I was looking yesterday, someone asked me about it. There is a Ventura 12.0 running on Windows 10 or something like that. So apparently it lives on.
I meant the original source code.
The original source code, the last I saw of it was when we sold it to Xerox in 1990. So.
Okay. And did you do ligatures?
The font, the width tables, we went with what the width tables told us. And so if the width tables had a ligature font in them and we had that data in the width table, then we would use that. So we were somewhat bound. We didn't do anything in the font space ourselves other than load the width table that it was for the PostScript fonts or the PCL fonts or whichever one they were. The one thing about ligatures that is slightly related is German hyphenation. The spelling changes at the end of the line when it's hyphenated, and so they don't just insert a hyphen, they sometimes insert extra characters, and so that was a couple weeks worth. I had not anticipated adding a character into the paragraph because of hyphenation. That was Swedish too? Yeah, okay.
So let's move ahead. Did anybody pay attention to the sales, to the marketing? Who did that?
So John Meyer, we were very blessed by having Xerox's entire organization trying to make money from this software because we had licensed it to them. We had I think it was a 5% royalty.
Was that your first sale?
Yeah, it was our first and only sale, really, was a licensing deal to Xerox. It was a $5 million non-refundable advance against royalties. This was signed basically 2 or 3 weeks after Comdex. So we were about 12 weeks into the company. But they didn't give us all that money up front. We had to actually ship the product. And so it's like we had a very, yeah. I clearly didn't.
Sorry, Lee,
surprised.
I have to ask, who negotiated, who drove all that from Xerox?
Larry Spellhog was our kind of internal champion. Does he get bonus points or negative points for that?
It's history.
So
It's complicated.
Yeah.
This is moving too fast. You started in business, you have $100,000.
Yep.
Dallas guys.
You go to Comdex 6 weeks after you start.
Yep.
You see Xerox, you see
Kodak,
and you
MicroPro, and 30 other companies. But those were the 3 that bidded for the.
So 3 of them bid to you as a result of that.
Yep.
And because of speed, was how you convinced them not to go with Aldus?
Well, Aldus was already out there, and they couldn't probably get Aldus because it was up and running successful company. They weren't really on the map. but they wanted to have something where they could make money from all of this technology that they had invented, and this was potentially a way to begin to do that in the document space. That's the way I looked at it. Maybe it's...
And to your question, I saw the demo, okay? And it was a really, really good demo. These guys were good at giving a demo. It was an impressive demo. And it was really fast. And it was creative. And there were these, companies stacked up who wanted to compete in this space. So this was a hot thing, very well presented. These guys were low-key, they weren't being salesy, they weren't making hyperbole stuff as you can see on this stuff, and it came across very well.
I guess my point, that the companies wanted exclusive use of this, was that the whole concept?
Yeah, we had pretty much made the determination that an exclusive partnership was going to be the only way to really do it in the app space, because we needed someone to do customer support and service and all of those other things, and it wasn't really an OEM to... Anyway, it seemed like a single company would be the thing that could compete with Aldus or compete with the other players.
But by this point in time, you had seen the success of the people at Adobe, and they went the opposite route.
But we had a lot of experience on the OEM licensing market, and so we knew how lucrative that could be. And if you have something, they had basically an imaging operating system. We had, at Digital Research, we had a disk operating system. And so, that's if you can get that position and own that, then it's really what apps get built on top of that operating system that make the operating system valuable to everyone. And whether that's, Aldus as an app that leverages PostScript, or it's, or all of the other apps that, Illustrator, et cetera, all the other apps that eventually pushed PostScript as a standard, then everyone has to license your standard. We had something a little bit different. We kind of from the beginning, we said we've got like a window of time here before memory gets really cheap and Windows gets faster and processors get faster, and all of those things are going to get solved over 3 or 4 or 5 years. So we've got to get in and cut a deal that's going to make our investors whole and go from there.
That was the key, that you saw a narrow time window, so you were looking for a relatively quicker payoff rather than a mammoth payoff. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say, well, we weren't opposed to a mammoth quick payoff. But yeah, that's correct. We didn't really feel like we were skeptical about the idea of building a big company, having lots of employees. We had kind of seen that at Digital Research, and that has a life of its own, and you sort of are committing to building a company, not a product. And I think the couple of us coming together, let's just get in and be successful.
So right away then,
What exactly did all the people that were bidding for your software want to do? Compete with PageMaker?
I would say
That was it.
that's a fair way of describing it. I mean, they saw it as the next, I think we probably described it as the next wave of word processing, so that this is where all word processors are eventually going to go, and so you have a chance to be there. We didn't really think of ourselves as typographers or, that type of thing. We thought of ourselves as a production system for short, medium, and long documents. And this, that ignorance of typography, I mentioned that earlier. When we, so I did the style sheet work from looking at all these documents, and one of the things that Time Magazine had in almost every article in Time Magazine, they had something that I called Big First Care. I learned later this is called an initial drop cap. And so in all of the versions of Ventura that were out there, there's a feature in the style sheet thing which is Big First Care, yes or no. And it was quite some time later that someone actually pointed out that there's a name for that. But so we didn't really understand it other than we saw it on paper and we said, okay, we've got to be able to do that effect.
you're talking very much coming from a word processing world and trying to build a better word processing system to use PostScript? Is that what you're saying?
I think it was a little different than that. I was telling someone else this. They said, we didn't really have a functional spec other than this grocery bag full of sample documents. And we said, if we could build this, I thought of it much more from a style sheet point of view. We could build the richest style sheets on the planet and then format everything based upon styles. And there was a magical thing that we demoed, which was you'd bring up a document and all the paragraphs would be body text and it would sort of not look like anything. And then you just, selection precedes command. You click on the paragraph and then off to the left there's a thing where you say, okay, that's a byline or that's a headline or that's a company name. And the style sheet instantly in front of your eyes, this thing that was just raw text became this beautifully published page. or document that you could then print out. And then the real magic was, we said, now let's change the style sheet from resume 1 to resume 2 to resume 3. And instantly, so the form separating from content, all of that stuff was core to what we could do with how the style sheets worked.
So over the 5 years, did you need other financing?
No, we, with $5 million a year as our guaranteed non-refundable advance against royalty, and that was a guarantee for basically, I think it was 4 years, and then we sold it in the 5th year for $18 million. So it was a very lucrative business for us. We're profitable every year at that level. And it was so, what caused the company to, I mean, you would think, okay, you're making lots of money and life is good, and this is on camera, so I have to be careful how I say all these parts, but the founder to founder tension, we didn't master what you guys had over 40 years because there's a certain expectation that you have, or we had entering the company where, you know, Don was my manager, John Meyer was in marketing, he was at a higher level, and in the first years of it, all those relationships kind of stayed the same, but we were all paid equally, the distributions were all equal, that was great, but there was a little bit of a feeling like I'm still your boss, I'll do my one little thing, and you can do everything else, and I'll focus on my one little thing. So I think that founder to founder tension, I got to the point where I remember writing back from Comdex with the guys, this is probably in 1989 or something like that, we see that Microsoft with Word is starting to add functionality. We had built these tables, equations, we had cutting edge style sheets, and we see Word is kind of creeping up on us, and now you're in the era of, you know, you're beyond 386s, 486s, and memory's not an issue anymore, and so some of our core advantages are kind of drifting away, and John Meyer's in one seat in the car driving back, and he's arguing, well, we got to go big, we got to hire a bunch of people, we got to build this big software company, and Don is on the other side, no, let's keep it really small, just us, we can do everything. And the we there was like the royal we, meaning Don and Lee can do everything. And so I was thinking, I don't really want to sit for the next 3 or 4 years or 5 years of my life mediating between these two very strong individuals and their view of what the company would have. And just at that point, thankfully, someone had come into Xerox that was wanting to build an applications group in Xerox, and they're the ones that sort of negotiated that they wanted to own the source code, which was the key, and that gave us a way out.
Did you trigger the fact that you wanted to sell, or was it much agreement?
They were pushing. We could have stayed in, and we were in total control. They had no rights. I mean, they had no.
And I don't mean that within the three of you.
Oh, did I trigger it? I think all on camera here. I think I artfully managed the situation, so as I think everyone sort of realized this is not gonna be much going forward if we. And it was easy to part friends in a way, and it was a success, and everyone could high five, and it was huge success. You know, it was a mammoth short-term success. You know, by anyone's definition. And if we'd have all put that money in Apple stock on that day, then we'd have done very well. But we didn't do that. So.
Or Xerox stock, you'd have done poorly.
Well, not as poorly as I did with some of what I did the money. Oh.
That's for tomorrow.
Yeah, that's for tomorrow.
Go ahead. There you go.
Yeah, it came on great. It seems like in this period of basically the 80s, that there's one successful package per platform, right? So you're on the PC, PageMaker's on the Mac, and Frames on the workstations. I was wondering what you thought the strengths and weaknesses of being on the PC rather than the other platforms were. You already mentioned the horrible things with the segmented memory model. But on the tech or business level, were there other things like device drivers or the customer base or expectations that you think were distinctive to the PC platform?
Yeah, I think well, first of all, just to slightly shade what you're saying, at the very beginning, I mean, FrameMaker was on the Sun, and Aldus was on the Mac, and we were on the PC. Everyone sort of got on each other's platforms sort of as time marched on. I think the particular advantages that we had on the PC, though, was just the ubiquity of the PC. And no one could do publishing on it because they needed a graphical operating system, and Windows didn't really work from 84 until 90 maybe. And so we had that kind of window of time in there when we sort of had it to ourselves, and that was a big advantage. So I think in terms of other advantages, the hardware did keep getting faster, and the memory there kept being new chunks of memory that would show up. We were so happy when there was something called high memory, which was outside of the 640K address space, and you could, and in our overlay manager, we could kind of stick stuff up there, and it was like an extra 64 or 128K. It felt like heaven had arrived, just in terms of extra memory up there. But eventually, we had to go to long model, and large model, and then and long pointers. But so I just saw it sort of the advantages that we had. Well, I guess I should say, one other thing was when we first, I can remember going to Comdex and seeing 386 for the first time, and our software running on 386. We had the same document we always loaded up with the space shuttle on it and some other 2-column document, and it would always load up, and the space shuttle would kind of line draw in fairly slowly. And it was like, we saw it first on the 386, it was like instantly there. It's like, oh my gosh, things are getting really fast. So the hardware did keep getting faster. And so I don't know in terms of I was not part of the Mac team. That was after we sold it to Xerox that did the Mac one. So,
John?
I'd love to have an insider view. Since I got to know John a little bit, I'd bump into him at most things, and obviously, being the type of person I was, I wanted to convince everybody that they should be on the Mac. Any inside discussion? We didn't get very far. He was pretty religious. In my view, and I was probably equally religious on the other side.
Well, John had the interesting role to play of representing us to the rest of the industry. And Don Heiskell is a very opinionated person. And so you were probably very happy to be talking with John as opposed to Don on these issues. I think the core thing was that we weren't opposed to doing a Mac version. However, we had gotten used to Xerox paying us to do things. And so unless Xerox was going to come up with some money to fund one of these things, and that extended itself to Windows. I can remember very well, if Charles was here, he might vouch for me here, but sitting across from Bill Gates in the Microsoft, in his office up there, and he's rocking back and forth, and he won't mind me saying that, I don't think, but he's explaining how he has a list of the graphic applications that he respects that are not on Windows. And we're like on that list and have been on that list for a while. So he's like saying, okay, what's it take to get you onto Windows? And we said, well, if you'll buy 10,000 copies on Windows, because we're not sure there's enough market there on Windows. So we're going to force him to buy inventory to do it. And he rocked for a few minutes, and then he got up and he stormed out of the room. And that was the last we heard at that meeting. And someone came in after him and kind of said, I think your meeting's over with Bill. and so we walked out, and that was fine. So Bill Gates was ultimately the seed round investor in a follow-on company, which is Shop.com, which was Catalog City and Shop.com. So he did eventually invest in something, but I learned, I think with people like that, they're used to everyone saying yes to them. And so when you say no to someone like that, then they actually kind of keep you on their list of, I want to eventually get to a yes with that person. That's at least the psychology I was thinking about. But at the time, it was kind of like, wow, what just happened, So, yeah,
I'm going to
come back.
If there's anything else you want to add, I'm going to break this off and go to the next one. Is there anything else you want to add on the thing?
Well, I think I'll just add in thanks and homage to the people in this room. I mean, I was so excited to be invited to this and get a chance to sit at the table with literally folks that were my heroes and idols and had created, software and hardware that allowed my whole career to happen, really. And not just as a user, but as someone who actually got to kind of walk down some of the trails from a system software and application software point of view. So anyway, thank you to everyone here. I really do appreciate it.
Just one final question. Ventura then continues as an identifiable separate product and name
There's
to
apparently a
today.
product called Ventura Publisher sold by Corel. I haven't kept track of it, but yes, I looked for it yesterday and it's still out there. So.
But you had never had any further involvement with it?
No, just a quick thing on the name. We also tried to get Spanish, we wanted to be called Ventana software because Windows and Ventana, and so we couldn't get that, and so we're in that same part of the Spanish dictionary, and Ventura was close to that, and Ventura means good fortune, and so that was a good
That's a
name.
great story.
Yeah.
David was going to speak, and just a question of timing. Let's go ahead with Aldus, and you'll talk after that.
We'll talk at the break.
Okay. I want to do Aldus, and then we'll have a short break. And you weren't here, you would have been the first after lunch, so you see,
Well, I think this actually worked out perfect.
beautifully. Now we'll start with you, start from the very beginning on the thing, Paul.
Well, as I said yesterday, I think Aldus is more of a story of sales and distribution and building a company than it is around technology, because we were trying to build on top of a platform, build on top of PostScript, and really we were depending on that three-legged stool of Apple and ourselves. There's a lot of things that I could cover, but many of them have already been told prior in terms of stories or on videotape, and I thought maybe focusing on two might be the most important, because I don't think these have really gotten the first of all would be the Apple Macintosh internal decision with the LaserWriter and Bruce Blumberg, and I'm really disappointed that he chose not to come or wasn't able to come, because he would have his own perspective. But I think between John and I, we can probably sketch that in, because that's a story that hasn't been told very much, because it was kept pretty quiet.
But before you start,
Yeah.
you start a company. When do
Right.
you start your own company? That's what I want to start.
1984, as of yesterday, we were all without jobs, and I had a choice of 17 engineers, clean cut, got stock in Kodak as a result of the acquisition of ATEX, so I put in $60,000 of my money. Engineers worked at half salary. I took no salary. We gave ourselves 6 months, so there's a lot of parallels with what Lee just described.
You say, was that your only financing? Was that
No,
60?
we raised one round of venture capital, which was $640,000, and then we sold the company 10 years later from founding at a public stock. We're both public companies, so that's all public information. $525 million was the
to,
Adobe, right? And then I served on the board for a couple of years.
that was 10 years after you started, so that was 1994 approximately?
So-
Okay, let me go back. So did you ever have to raise more money? Or
No.
you? So
One round of financing, we went cash flow positive within 3 months of shipping our product.
how much did you give on ownership to get the 640,000?
Well, the technical founders got 10% of the stock. Since I put up the money, I had 50% of the stock, and the investors got about 30%. The employees got 20, 25. The tech founder group, it was kind of
A loosey-goosey thing of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But you had half the company.
Yes.
And your investors, were they professional investors or were they
Yes.
just people you knew?
No, they were. It was a venture capital firm here out. Doug DeVivo was his name, and it was a lot of investors from Apple, actually, the very first Apple employees. There's a story around that, but I've already told that story, so I don't think we need to.
1984 then?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now, who was with you? How many people you had? 17, you said? Or-
Oh, no. That was the total number of engineers working on microcomputer development at Adobe, or excuse me, at ATEX. Too many A's in this equation. So as I said yesterday, there were 4 technical co-founders, and I want to give full credit to them, but that's not the story of Aldus. The story of Aldus is about marketing, sales, and strategic partnerships. It's not about the technology.
Just trying to get some
Jeremy
foundation.
Jake, Mike Templeman, Mark Sundstrom, and Dave Walder should get loads of credit, because they were the engineers that figured out how to make all this work in an impossible, nearly impossible environment. And that was a result of the operating systems not being graphical, quick draw limitations, some challenges in PostScript in the early days with bugs. Basically, it was I think the major technical challenge was the memory challenges that we had, particularly on the PC side. It was just the 32-bit or 16-bit address space was just killing us. But of the stories I could tell, I think the two that are most important are the Apple Macintosh and how they came around after Steve Jobs left the company and John Sculley took over, and the international marketing story, because that's something that we did that no one else did. So do you want to do those two? Okay. So I had an audience with Steve from time to time, because he wanted PageMaker on the Macintosh, and they were coming out with this incredible new machine called the Macintosh, and he had it in mind. Software developers he's going to sell millions of these Macintoshes, right? And so it was supposed to be $79, $89 for each of the applications. So I met with him and had an audience and listened to him politely, and he told me that price my software at $89.95, and I kind of thought about that, and I said, no, I don't think so, but I didn't say anything. I just let it be. We priced it at $495, which for the publishing industry compared to $2,500 that we're hearing about FrameMaker in the workstation market was pretty aggressive. And that's how we went cash flow positive, and it's also how we were able to build the company because we had enough cash in order to invest in technical support, distribution, marketing, and manufacturing, all the things we needed to do. If we hadn't set that price point, we wouldn't have been able to have that cash flow. But Steve was on his way out. I think, Steve mellowed over the years and changed as we all have. But at that point, I was visiting Apple probably once a month, and you'd walk into the Macintosh division there on Infinite Loop Way, and there were certain things I admired and other things that weren't so admirable. But Bruce Blumberg had a basic problem, which was he was coming out with the LaserWriter printer, and the sales force at Apple had pretty much rebelled, as John reported yet earlier. They were afraid it was going to be another Lisa. It was way above the price point of the Apple II, and they basically said, no, we don't want to sell this printer, and you're also not making any profit on it. I mean, and I think there was some board influence that came into that as well, but I was never really a party to that, so I don't know. But Steve left, and then and I'd been working with Bruce Blumberg, because he would, every time I'd come down, he'd say, let's go take a walk. And we would walk through the halls of Apple and find somebody that had some money somewhere that was willing to work with us on PageMaker and do marketing and sales. And it was extremely helpful, unbelievably helpful. But one day he called and he said, I am making a presentation to the board of directors at Apple at John Sculley's request of what we can do about the Macintosh. The Macintosh sales are not good right now. We're selling under 1,000 units a month. And I want you to produce the marketing plan for desktop publishing for Apple Computer. And I said, oh, God. So we had 6 weeks to do it. I delivered it to him in 5, so we had 1 week to revise it. I worked with a marketing consultant in Seattle, and we proposed a $1.5 million marketing program for Apple that included advertising showing what the LaserWriter could do that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report, and several other of the large publications. And then most importantly, a tour of the United States for training salespeople at Apple dealers. And we did 2 sets of these tours with Russell from Adobe and Aldus came together, we paired. We went to Apple sales offices in 14 cities over about 3 months. So we'd do 1 city a day, usually with 12 to 15 Apple sales representatives from Apple dealers, show them how to demonstrate the software, how to sell the software, how to price the software, how to do it. We just basically laid it out for them. And lo and behold, it worked, Our advertising budget in our business plan was $50,000. So to have Apple spending $1.5 million on this was really amazing. But we just laid out some very big, and we had a brochure in there that became the famous desktop publishing brochure that was beautifully produced. Steve had full credit for, good aesthetics and typography and stuff. But we've just put all those pieces together and ran out a classic marketing campaign that was planned very quickly. Apple didn't have a whole lot of options on the table at that point. It was a bet, but it paid off. And we couldn't take it to Europe right away because the problem was we couldn't get enough LaserWriters. Canon, in the one factory they had in Japan, couldn't produce enough. I can't remember the details, and John, you may be able to. But I know we had to wait on the UK launch for almost 6 months because we had allocated production on the LaserWriter from Canon. We couldn't get enough engines. And that was very frustrating.
I can talk to all that.
Good. So that's my part of the Apple story. I wasn't there for the presentation. I don't know what the politics were within Apple. I kept that confidential for years and years. It was basically between me and Bruce Blumberg, and there's only 3 or 4 people that knew about that.
Before you go further, what was your financial deal with Apple?
We had none.
How were you going to make money?
You're just using their platform.
So you were going to get $4.95 for each one that's sold.
But we were selling that to our customers. We were just using their platform. We never had a contract with Apple Computer. We never received any money from Apple.
John, you're involved in that?
Intimately. I'd perfectly content to just have him do his story. My view is it's a little different, and so I'll tell you what happened inside, but I think it ought to be done in a context, because this is an Aldus perspective.
Okay, we'll pick this up
Yeah,
then.
because I was
Okay.
looking at a lot of different things, and this was one of the perspectives.
We'll pick that up then.
It was the
during
dominant perspective, but I'll give you a little more nuance on it.
Okay, you had a second story you wanted to tell?
Which is the international story, because I had a great interest in international business. And so in building the company, early on, we enlisted international distributors. Again, Apple helped us, because when I went into a country, I'd go to the Apple subsidiary and say, which distributors should I use? Because there's usually 10 of them in a country that were selling or distributing application software. So we made progressive commitments in each country with contracts in terms of international distribution, and then sometimes we'd buy out the distributor and become our subsidiary. But we ended up with 23 subsidiaries selling product in 50 countries, with 60% of our business international. And this played in very importantly to the Adobe merger, because their business model, they'd done well, but not to the extent we had. I think it was about 40%. And our international group was extremely skilled in terms of the interactions with the publishing industry within their country, because we chose local managers that understood each of the countries. We didn't bring Americans into France, or we didn't bring into, so, and we had some really good people, as John and Chuck know. And so when we finally sold the company, that was 20% of the business we could increase almost overnight, which we pretty much did within the 12 months that followed. But I had a special interest at, and we've translated into 7 languages within the first year, and then eventually, I think, into 13 languages overall, including right to left and Chinese and so forth.
So how could you buy these distributors? Did you have that kind of money to do that? You only had this limited amount of cash.
Well, these were little tiny companies in that day that were distributing application software. There was no micro Ingrams. A typical company in France might distribute 5 application products. So they might be 5, 6 people.
What kind of deals did you cut with them? So once you didn't buy, what kind of percentage did you split?
Well, we couldn't necessarily control the price legally in each country. The U.S. selling price was $4.95, so that was somewhat of a limit, depending on the language and the specialization. But we did all the localization and the translation of our manuals, so all they were really doing was providing distribution. So theoretically, they should be making 20 to 30% in the distribution model, as you would see it today, but in many cases, they were making 100%. They would buy our product at a discount, mark it up more than the value of which really limited our sales in some markets.
They work as an OEM, in effect, bundling it with hardware and anything
No, they were
else?
simply a distributor.
They were strictly a
We
software
provided
distributor.
them packaged product in their language, packaged, ready to
And
sell
did you sell in the United States?
through distributors.
You distributors again, so you never built your own sales force?
Oh,
other than
yes,
just
we had our own
sell to
sales force.
distributors?
We had worldwide, in terms of sales force, we probably had 150 to 160 people selling. But they were going into the end user customers, the bigger customers, and selling to the distributors. So the sales force sold to distributors, and they also sold to our Donnellys and the Fortune 500 and all of those companies. So we'd go in and make sales for 100 copies or 200 copies or 500, whatever.
So you eventually, you were going through these distributors to get the volumes that you needed.
That's correct.
What kind of numbers did you sell? Do you remember how many, either dollars worth or numbers of units?
That's all public
Yeah, I know, just tell us.
information. Well, it depends on the year and stuff. So immediately we just started selling hundreds of copies, and within the first year, I think we sold 30,000, and far exceeded my expectation. Then we were selling 100,000, and the challenge, of course, with a one-product company was the same one that's been discussed so far, is that you get to a certain stage and you can't maintain that momentum, and how do you diversify your product line?
That was the choice they made was to sell out. The choice they made was to build more product. Why did you make your decisions?
We were trying to do both, but the problem with the platform was such a challenge in this time frame because of the memory and all this other stuff. We kind of, PageMaker wasn't PageMaker, it was PageMaker. We also adopted a core graphics model so that we could go to the Mac or the PC, and we had to deal with all these technical issues that consumed more and more resources just to keep, because we didn't have the memory address space that we needed in order, so we're constantly rewriting the application to try to keep it going on the current platforms. But we had all these people coming to us to offer license their software, like Lee, or not Lee, but others, and we did do licensing deals and acquisitions, not necessarily, sometimes for product, sometimes for the people. Like one of the, and sometimes that was misinterpreted because I couldn't explain it necessarily to the market. Like Silicon Beach Software had some technology, but it really didn't have great software developers. But it had Bruce Chizen that became the CEO. He was a great manager, and he was worth all of the $2.5 million I paid for Silicon Beach Software and himself, because he became a major player in this whole thing. He was a great manager. I really liked him, and I needed that type of management talent, and I figured we could get some value out of the technology as well.
That's the point. So you had enough revenue, enough profit to be able to have money to buy companies.
Oh, yeah.
How many did you buy?
We probably bought 5 or 6.
What kind of deals did you cut with each of them?
They all varied. It depended what the founders wanted to do, whether they wanted to just leave and be off and gone, or whether they wanted to be a part of our company, and and then we give them stock options.
He bought After Effects.
Me?
Right.
He
Bought
bought
After
After
Effects,
Effects,
yeah.
and that was really a good buy.
Yeah. Some were good, some were bad.
Yeah.
Tell me what you think was the best one, in your opinion, not in John's.
It's really hard to say. Again, each had its different purpose. Some cases it was technology, like After Effects. It was just wonderful engineering. We really thought strongly about it. And other cases it was management talent. And I got diverted on a few that one that came back to haunt us big time when we started to
Which one was
merge
that?
with Adobe. That was Altsys and Freehand, which was the competitor to Illustrator.
Who were your major competitors during this period of time?
Well, at the beginning, there was probably 10 or 15 people trying to develop applications on the Macintosh and PC. There were a lot of them, but most of them didn't have necessarily the technical capacity to actually write the code or the understanding of the industry, or most of the products technically weren't very good. Lee's was one of the exceptions. So you had to be very cautious in buying things, and Microsoft actually got into that bind when Melinda bought or licensed this Macintosh software for the Mac, but it had no technical capacity to do what it said it would do. So within 6 months it died. But so you had to have a grasp of the technology as well as the market and the needs of the customers, and that was the key.
Must have been, in order for the price that they paid, after just 10 years, you must have been a very profitable company.
No, we were always profitable. In '92, though, our revenue stream started to slow down because we couldn't keep up in terms of the new versions and the things that are coming out. Because you get to a certain scale and you just have to, you need more than one major product to really push it. We had, altogether, I think we had 13 different products at different times on the platforms, most of which you will never remember.
This was 1994 you sold? Have that right?
Yes.
I'd like to finish that part of the story because we didn't ask you this question. Why did you buy?
It was, we didn't have a page layout system. There was Quark and there was PageMaker. And I think, you correct me if you disagree, but we were not enamored with Quark. And so we felt that we needed to sort of enter, we'd done FrameMaker. Did we do FrameMaker first or second?
After.
FrameMaker after. Yeah, so we felt that to flesh out the graphic authoring system, we needed page layouts. We had, we eventually bought FrameMaker for large structured documents that were industrial strength. PageMaker, obviously, for desktops, newsletters, and it was becoming more and more sophisticated. So it was a very good, powerful program. And we also felt that we could use it as a platform. We knew about what they were working on. And that was really a really first-rate, high-power thing, and we really wanted to kill Quark.
That's what I was trying to get at, because you paid, I don't know, did you buy it for the income stream? Did you buy it to kill Quark? Why did you buy it?
We bought it to fill out the application set.
But you wanted the whole range.
Absolutely.
And you felt that was either, I'm trying to see, you had obviously very top-notch development skills at engineering skills, as I guess you called them.
Yes.
You could have built your own.
Not in the timeframes you need to respond to the markets.
No,
I mean, even though I've loved your story, even though
6
some
weeks is
people
all it
could
would have
do
taken
it-
you,
yeah,
right.
Even though you could do it in 6 weeks, maybe not.
No, that was my point, is that complex and that difficult, what was built into PageMaker, that said to yourselves, hey, it's not spending the 6 months, a year, and the, I don't know, $2 million it would take us to build it.
All right, let me give you a little piece of rationale. The PostScript business and the application business is like a 90% gross margin. So you're really in a very, very profitable state. You accumulate cash like crazy. Okay, so we have a lot of cash now, and we had a lot of cash then. And I think we did a cash deal.
Did a cash deal, and we had a lot of cash too. So part of that 525 million was cash. I mean, for cash. It wasn't as if we were leveraging it.
Oh, in other words, you didn't keep the balance sheet. They took over the balance sheet.
No, we bought the whole thing.
You
We
okay?
bought everything. So
One more point, though. So in other words, their profit stream was so strong that you felt that that was worthwhile just in its own right, not just in terms of what else it would give you in terms of a total market
and you
package.
can leverage off of the distribution channel. We had common distribution channels. You can
National.
leverage off of development costs because a lot of it uses core technology. You can leverage off of all kinds of things. You can make your marketing message much stronger because you're covering the whole space. For me, it was a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But one question of you, Paul. Do you remember what your revenues were in the year before you sold it, 1993 or 94?
236 million.
Okay. Now I see the numbers.
Yeah, I think that we should emphasize that time to market was critical for us, because we didn't want to wait 2 or 3 years before we could be in a position to be truly competitive with PageMaker,
Why didn't you buy them 2 or 3 years earlier?
because we're not always smart.
I see.
Well, and
was
you
ready
were
to-
very involved with the company, and
Right.
you were growing, and, you know,
Maybe they weren't for sale. you
they
mean.
weren't for sale.
Yep. And
I wanted to ask a meta question.
Pardon me?
I wanted to ask a meta question. We have several company founders here. They've all done acquisitions. Maybe this question doesn't make any sense, but what fraction of the acquisitions need to succeed for you to feel good about it? Presumably, most of them don't succeed.
it's a high-risk proposition.
Right, so if I mean, the rule of thumb I have in the
One big one.
The rule of thumb I have in the back of my mind is for venture capital, probably 9 out of 10 are going to fail.
Right.
Is it the same for acquisitions, or do you expect 1 out of 3 to succeed, or how does it go?
But the issue is a private company, an application software company, was valued at half or less of the value of a public company, because the public companies have more leverage in the market in terms of their investment. So when we acquired, as long as it was profitable, we acquired it and could succeed at least breaking even with where they were, We just increased the multiple value of our company by 3x for their revenue stream. I don't know if you understand what I just said. I didn't
We
say
would
that very
discount,
clearly.
I was doing valuation of companies then, and the valuation of a private company was considerably less than the public. And the public company often felt it would get leverage on not just have that as a business and then get its stock value up here, it could do far, far more.
But you've
David?
built all of this infrastructure for selling, to have the sales force, to have the international presence, to have all of the accounting systems, all of the tracking systems, all of the development support, and you can leverage all of that.
Did
So
you,
can, Bert,
I see. Did you get rid of most of the people when you hired?
No,
David, you were next.
Forgive the question, I can't remember when the hostile takeover attempt was made.
1998.
Okay, so it's after.
Many years, 5 years. Go ahead, Tom Haig.
So yesterday, you explained how, in the end, to take on Quark, you needed to build InDesign, right? Impress, what's it called?
yes.
Yeah. And just now you explained how you had to acquire PageMaker.
That's where InDesign came from.
That
So-
was PageMaker, the
Oh,
next
right.
version.
So the
with
code,
their imaging model.
like, because
No.
as far as I knew,
code's-
right,
the code's
PageMaker
different.
withered away.
No, yes, it did. But the guys who built PageMaker were really good software architects. They had some they had one bright lady, I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
But she was really good at object-oriented programming, and the architecture in InDesign was a rewrite of PageMaker.
Total rewrite.
Total rewrite. And PageMaker had an ongoing revenue stream until InDesign could get launched.
So in the longer term, it was the team that was more important than the product itself.
Adobe.
Well, and After Effects and the other products that they had that were really good.
You ended up with a total solution in effect.
Yes.
It gave you a lot of leverage on those things.
Well, and I apologize for going into the 2000s
You're
region.
allowed a little bit.
But when we switched to the licensing, or for the rental model, they were. Subscription.
Subscription.
Model. God, I can't remember words anymore. When we went to the subscription model, you can go into a corporation and you can say you buy all of your graphics capability, all your page makeup capability, all of your publishing capability in one spot for one subscription price.
No interfacing issues, and do they work together issues, and will they stay synchronized issues, and all those things go
None of
away.
those issues. And so you go into a big corporation and they have 10,000 seats. You cut a really nice deal that's a subscription deal. And you end up really doing quite well.
On shock.
I was just going to, just to leap back and pop the stack. Butler, you asked a question about acquisitions, and it, I think one needs to try to identify, there are different kinds of acquisitions, so there isn't a single answer. So, just some of the ones that come to mind, there's the classic 10-engineer acqui-hire that sort of has a price per engineer. You may get some code. They may or may not have launched it. It may or may not have been very successful. And I've sold several companies to Microsoft this way. It's like, okay, they get 10 guys, they get the code. Half of them have to move to Seattle, or all of them in the first ones, and then later not. And you sort of run some numbers and what it works. And you assume that 3/4 of the people will stay and will work out, and they'll be grade B+ engineers, and will find a place in the organization, either in that product or not. And you can generally label all those as success. And the product may or may not be right, or it's a module, or it's an add-on. So that's one category I would think of. There's another category that I always liked that Cisco was able to do. So Cisco had a superb marketing organization, a very diverse product portfolio, and they would go in and they would buy a company that was further along, that was doing $5 or $10 million in revenue, and they would pay $10 million for it. If it wasn't one of mine, I would say that's a ridiculous price. Why are those guys at Cisco such idiots to pay $100 million for whatever it was? Well, they would turn right around, they would get rid of all the infrastructure except the engineers, they would jam it through their channel, they would put their label on it, and in the first quarter, they'd sell $50 million worth. And you say, oh my God, that was a brilliant idea, because it had to interoperate. I mean, you get a fast Ethernet switch, whatever generation it was, and you'd pay $100 million for copper or somebody, I forgot which one, or Grand Junction, and you got the product and you got the infrastructure and to sell it through, and like every one of those was a winner. And 3 years later, you'd buy the next one, you know, which was sort of the next generation, and you just had to change the color and change the label and give it to your sales force. So those all.
Integration wasn't the big issue.
Integration was about the documentation more than anything else, you know, and it had to sort of work. I mean, it had to physically interoperate and do the right thing, but you didn't have to. And later, of course, you'd kill yourself trying to put them on a common code base and so on. So those could count as successes. And the toughest ones, and I'm missing a bunch of categories, and other people can speak to this, is where you're doing two fairly large companies, and if you have the right cultural fit and expectations and a lot of things line up, you do pretty well. But the really big blow-ups are where the cultural fit doesn't work, and Chrysler and Mercedes-Benz is going to be a 50-50% ownership and joint management. Yeah, over my dead body. That's never going to work. And so those are the real, and if it happens with 10 people, it's like, okay, fine, that was a mistake, and you move on. But it's those giant ones that are either technically or culturally a mismatch, and you get an impedance mismatch. Those are really bad. And there's probably some other categories. So there isn't a single. So I can say that 100% of the acqui-hires work because you keep half the people and you feel okay about it, and you paid $1 million a head or whatever it was in this day and age. That's okay, fine. That 100% of those are successful. The really big ones, I'd be surprised if I'd call half of them successes.
And we look at the cultures very, very, very closely. And after the acquisition of Aldus, we had no attrition.
We spent, though, it was probably the most planned program acquisition that we had secret teams meeting in cities that nobody would spy us at the airports for 3 months, working out all the management arrangements to the minute as to which employees would be informed, and all the issues were resolved. And it's seldom that depth of work went on. But there was this fundamental trust in us, in the integrity of the people involved. I think that's really what it gets down to. That I respected John and Chuck for their technical abilities. They respected me for whatever I'd done, but we trusted each other. It really comes back to that ultimately. And the cultures were similar, although they were different.
Jonathan, you had something.
I wanted to go back to the into the weeds here for a second. There's a lot we can talk about acquisitions. So you guys had been working on a graphic terminal at ATEX, okay? Looks familiar. You had all the address space you wanted, you had memory you wanted to work with here. So when you left, first thing happened when you called me and said you were leaving, I offered you a job, and you said, no, I've got something else I want to do. And then later I came up and saw what you were doing. But how much of that was bringing what you'd learned from the ATEX graphic terminal and trying to squeeze it down into a small box, and how much of this was rethinking what you were doing?
Pretty much 100% rethinking. That all shifted, and that all happened in about 3 weeks from our founding. So we were all fired or out of work because they closed the facility. And we all got in my car and we went down Interstate 5 as far as 2 states and stopped at every small newspaper and publication along the way. And that thing that's right there was not, that's the 18-month sales cycle to a more professional newspaper market. And we'd be out of business. So that's where we fundamentally shifted our strategy to appeal to the newsletter writer, the smaller documents, 16 pages or less, using the paste-up model very consciously. We weren't doing long document form, so we didn't put all that style sheet stuff. We just took the platform and built the paste-up model, basically.
That took you 3 weeks, basically, from the time you started to make that shift in the market decision?
Yes. I could see after that trip that we would be out of business if we waited for these newspapers to buy whatever we were creating, which was what we'd already defined.
Because at the time I came up to see you, you'd already made that mental shift.
Correct. Yep.
I've got another meta question.
The talk up.
I'd like to ask the people here, it's clear from your comments that that getting valuable employees is, is really important, that there seem to be some employees that are worth 100 of others. And so I just wanted to, there's a debate going on among educators in computer science as to whether or not good programmers are born or made. And so I just wonder what your opinion is. Is there something something about a great programmer that is sort of developed by the time he's or she is 17 years old, or is it something that they learn because they've had great teachers?
I think it's both. I don't think it's either or. But the difference between a average programmer and an excellent programmer, like John was relating Photoshop, is an order of magnitude difference in terms of their productivity and their ability to create great code.
At least.
At least.
Yeah.
And maybe 100. I mean, it's huge.
Maybe it's infinite.
It's a lot. So whenever you came across those people, they tended to have interesting backgrounds. There is some connection to music, I think. I noticed that. People that were into music seem to have good minds for programming. But, you don't really know until you get them there.
I think one thing I would add to that in terms of I think a period of time where you are watching someone else program who's better than you or different than you. And that was something that happened a lot at Digital Research because we're working on existing code and there's some engineer that has that. And when you were first a new engineer there, you were kind of looking over the shoulder while they were coding. It's something that you learn when you have like an idea of how you would do it, but then you see someone doing it in a better way and you're like, oh, well, I need to add that to my toolbox. And all of a sudden you begin to, so it's almost more like a craft apprentice kind of model. Anyway.
I guess I want to rephrase it a little bit. So I think it was Fred Grunberger told me about 1970 that his experience as a teacher was that 2% of his students really resonate with computers. And I started thinking of that as a model and testing that out with my own experience as the people I met and the projects that I saw that, I saw a lot of projects that succeeded and failed, and the ones that failed, it seemed to me that they had somebody involved who wasn't one of that 2% doing the coding, right? And so, I was at the University of Illinois visiting, I remember, I think it was 1977, and I was talking about this 2% hypothesis to a guy there, and I said, well, how many graduate students are there at the University of Illinois in Champaign? And he said 11,000. How many are computer science majors? 220. It was a perfect 2%. Okay, so now. When I heard that Sarah Palin was running for president years ago, and she comes from the town of Wasilla in Alaska, I say, oh, okay, there are 20 computer or 200 computer programs in Wasilla probably, but anyway, this hypothesis that there are a certain percentage of people who have this peculiarity, whatever it is, that correlates with music or whatever, but good programming, is that a viable hypothesis, or is it, or if it turns out that the world needs more programmers, does it just mean that we have to get more kids into majoring in programming? That's sort of the question that I'm wrestling with.
I think we both think having a mathematics background was a huge advantage. So having to solve problems in your head is really also a property of people who I believe that program well. So here's sitting one of the world's fastest programmers. He's amazing. So, but I think that having a strong analytic foundation, ability to carry a lot of thoughts in your head at the same time, organize and structure things so that they fall in place with just mental exercise is sort of the prerequisite to writing programs.
But there are different kinds of demand for programmers.
You're on a
I mean,
different subject.
When the Labor Department says that we need 5 million programmers in the next 10 years, they're not talking about these 2% people.
Larry, I'm collecting software history right now. Let's go another subject. Tom, did you have a question on this subject?
I have a question on PageMaker.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Oh, is that the current section?
So, PageMaker is right up there with VisiCalc as, the paradigmatic example of a killer app where people would buy the whole platform just to run it. At least that's the perception. So the question would be like, at the beginning, is it true that basically every customer is buying a Mac and a LaserWriter just to run the program? And how does that change over time? Is there some point in the 90s where most customers have already got the platform they need and they're buying it as one extra application to run along many?
It's a little more complicated than that, because publishing is a part of every office as a piece of that. In the early days, that was assigned to particular people typically because of the history that we've talked about yesterday in terms of the earlier, that they had a particular affinity to that. Either they were interested in graphics design or photography or typography, and they were assigned this task. And then when PageMaker came along, they continued on, but with a much powerful tool that saved them time and money and gave them control. As that evolved over time, more and more people became familiar with the graphical user interface, the Macintosh, Windows, and more people were able to participate in the publishing activities other than those people that were in the early 80s and 70s. So it became a much broader market, for sure. But that didn't mean that those people had tremendous publishing skills. There was this whole need to educate about aesthetic and design and quality of production that still maintains itself today. And that was a great philosophical debate at a lot of the Seabold of the old core holding this cherished value of quality and excellence in type and design, and that was true. I felt that myself. But when you open it up to a bigger market, to millions of people, where does that go? You get a lot of junk, initially. But over time, it resolved itself. The people with design skills still have value. And they came back and they create these documents. So,
We're going
Does
to cut it.
PageMaker sell more or less than Microsoft Publisher?
oh, I think we sold more until they bundled it. They basically gave publisher away. So at that point, you can't compete. So
That presumably has a sizable effect on this
Right.
sort of unprofessional publishing market.
that's correct. So that was the constant challenge that I probably underappreciated. And we had a lot of technical difficulties in those early days with the languages and the memory space and all that, which really kept us occupied. And we just didn't have the resources. But we knew we had to go to that professional space. And that's why we were re-engineering PageMaker from the ground up at the time that Adobe bought it. And they put their imaging model in it. So it wasn't, it became even bigger. But that's why in design is one in the marketplace now.
Okay, we're cutting off the PageMaker discussion, and we are going to do one more before we do our break. I'd like to talk about Apple. It's a little different kind of story, but tell us about LaserWriter and so forth and how that fits into this from an Apple standpoint.
Okay. Probably first start, I think Paul hit on something about that probably hasn't been spoken as enough at the beginning, and that's just the foundation. And really, Steve should be getting a gazillion amount of credit for a lot of this, since he really was he and his team really were the architect that thought through, whether he knew it or not.
A little further forward.
Whether he knew it or not, the Mac and with graphical interface and with the fonts and then with the LaserWriter in convincing these guys. I mean, he really set the foundation. Much of this is all foundational. I was pretty fortunate to step into a situation where a lot of the pieces were either there or just about to be there. And so probably just needed to be kind of pulled together. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But put a context, 1985, I think we've talked about it. The LaserWriter was introduced at the beginning of the year. I think it sold 2,000 the first month, went to 1,600 the second month, went to 1,200 the next month, went to 800 the next month, and was at 400 when I took over. I mean, it's basically on that. And it's kind of like, and so now I kind of understood the urgency. So in the context, Steve had just left. He had been, encouraged out the door, the company was in complete crisis. The Mac was not doing well. The Mac Office had been introduced. The LaserWriter was part of the Mac Office with the Lemming advertisement, if you remember that, trying to do the sequel to the 1984 ad, just completely, was the wrong thing to do. Kind of slapped customers, and we were wanting to get into business, and it was just everything was going wrong. And and that led to Steve obviously leaving. It's kind of a tough situation, but Apple got kind of political. So you could see the beginnings of it. The precursor, and that we'll continue that over the next 3 years, and I'll give maybe some additional insight. But the context was crisis. So they reorged the whole company. Divisions were blown up. There was no Apple II. There's no the peripherals division. There was no Macintosh division. All blown up. And it went to, functionally, there was one product development group. Originally, a gentleman named Jean-Louis Gassée was supposed to take over maybe as becoming the head of the Mac division. But when that got blown up, I guess you'll be in charge of products. And here's a gentleman who had been the head of Apple France, basically a sales and marketing gentleman, quite opinionated. We'll get back to that in a second. And so from a sales and marketing standpoint, we went with consumer, education, and business. I got put in the business category because the Mac Office was heading into business. LaserWriter was a key part that we had to figure out how to turn it around. So I'm like, holy, this is a challenge. I had myself and a summer intern. Okay, let's put context. No budget, zero. But there was a lot of resources around the company, and I'd been there, for a couple of years. I'd been responsible for the retail rollout of the Mac. And so I kind of knew the sales organization. I had sold computers before joining Apple, so I understood the dealer network quite well. And so that was proved to be quite helpful. So I'm like, okay. So it was May of 1985. And I'm like, whoa, I got a fun summer ahead of me, because I had to figure out, because I knew it was a crisis, and I knew that if I didn't figure out a way to turn it around fast, this was going to be dead. And so I didn't have the luxury of, let's take 6 months, let's do a planning, let's do it. So I went and, first thing I did is I went and talked to the smartest people inside the company. Bruce Blumberg was in charge of the LaserWriter, and so there's several people in our technical team, tried to get everything I could from them. And then I started to figure out who in the outside world was really smart. Obviously Adobe was somebody. I had to go figure out how to get as much brain power as I could, and they were fantastic. Then it was like our software. We had an evangelist. Probably everyone's heard of Guy Kawasaki, but we had an evangelist group. And I said, okay, who's doing anything interesting having to do with the LaserWriter? And obviously PageMaker, who I knew nothing about, because at the point, even though I was in the Mac division, I was doing a special project trying to figure out how and whether Mac should be in the education system, in the K-12, because that was a big deal. We had been a university, and Apple II was K-12, and it was like pretty, and I said, I think we're about to get blown out of the K-12 unless Mac gets in there. So I got assigned a special project to go do that. So I was kind of in my own little world when I got given this. So I knew not much about the Mac Office, other than obviously they sat in the cubes right next to me. So I took it over and started talking to people. It turns out I think there are 3 page layout programs. Mac Publisher it had come out in like December of '84. So it had actually been the first page layout. Aldus, who one of the inside investors was Gene Carter. So he was the former VP of sales of Apple. So that raised their credibility pretty high because he was involved. And so I could talk to him. And obviously I went and, got to know Paul. And they had a consultant that had put together a pretty interesting marketing plan, which I was given a copy. And then I talked to Manhattan Graphics, it was a company called Ready, Set, Go. And so there were 3 contenders, and I was like, okay, so now let's figure out, are they all the same? Who's better, who's not? And so I got some help to from some of our evangelists and technical team to kind of say, hey, who's really good here? Who's going to, it wasn't that long, just a matter of a few weeks, because before I was pretty clear that while the other ones were pretty interesting and had a lot of stuff going for them, that the group at Aldus was a step above. Okay, just that technically they were probably going to pull it off, more likely, well, Mac Publisher was not WYSIWYG. Ready, Set, Go was. And so that kind of separated it. But Ready, Set, Go was just too small of a group. Just, if they had enough money, they may have been able to pull it off, but they just didn't. And so all this became, okay, pretty clear, that's what we want. So then I'm like, okay, so I figured out that. The goal was, what is the least number of players to create a solution that our sales organization, our dealers could actually sell, and sell successfully. Okay, so you didn't want it complex, you wanted enough that it could work, and so it looked like we could really simplify it. We had MacWrite and Mac Paint, so at least we had a word processor. Microsoft, I forget exactly, I don't think Word was really quite there yet, okay, but it was coming. And we had Draw that was coming, so we had some graphic stuff coming, but we basically had enough with PageMaker and MacWrite. And if you needed a little graphic, let's throw in Paint, right? And so we had enough to do it, especially right now, given we only had this limited size of a computer. We didn't even have the Mac Plus yet, right? It's just the 128, it wasn't even the 512 yet. And so, and no hard drive. So kind of figured out that solution. So then I continued talking, met Jonathan, and he was extremely helpful in, kind of understanding who the players, but we also had, guys, Tim Baharan, there were a bunch of other analysts that were Mac people that they'd been starting to follow it. So they're giving kind of input. So I'm like, it's a fire hose. We're talking in 6 weeks, I had to figure out whether we're going to try to do something this fall or not. Because you had a certain window. If you didn't have a marketing thing in the field ready to go in August, that you could do something in September for it to be in Q4, you were done. Might as well pick it up in January. So it was really compressed, okay? So that, I kind of was getting that all pretty good. But one thing that kind of was always here, as I talked to people, and I talked to the Adobe guys, Aldus in particular, a couple of the analysts, a couple of the other kind of, they really weren't analysts, they were more the magazine guys, and Jonathan, I was kind of this whole name, desktop publishing, or, because my memory may be a little wrong on who, but basically, if you take these 3 gentlemen, each of them had, at that time, had a different view on the name. They wanted desktop publishing. Okay, that was real clear. You guys didn't. You wanted some other name, and it's either electronic publishing or professional publishing, and this is in June of 1985. Don't confuse it with when we launched, okay? But at that time, as I was going around and trying to figure out, other people are suggesting PC publishing, and others were suggesting micro publishing, and I'm like, wow, okay, what are we going to do? And so I did 2 things. Fortunately, Stanford has a publishing course that they do in the summer every year, where they brought in people from the publishing industry to Stanford, and it just happened to coincide with when you had, it was still beta software, but it was solid enough that you guys were pretty confident it wasn't going to bomb. So we got a demo of, the LaserWriter, the Mac, and PageMaker, and we brought the whole class. They came and got the demo, and so they were all blown away. So that's like made me feel pretty good that I think we're really onto something. I then asked them about names, and there were a variety. Some were high-end guys, and they liked electronic publishing or professional publishing. The smaller business guys liked desktop publishing. It felt desktop computers, da-da-da. Okay, another check. I then, again, all of this super compressed. We did some market research focus groups. We did three different focus groups in the Bay Area of different types because we knew who we wanted to go after, at least the hypothesis. Are we going after corporate? Are we going after small business? Are we going after just graphic arts and kind of publishing type folks? And there are three different groups because I wanted to get as much as I could as fast. And so that also reinforced, and I'd also used it as a selling opportunity inside of Apple, right? Because I had no budget. So I had to convince the training department that it was worth them pulling time off, doing other things, and putting my agenda ahead of others. Okay, I had to do that. I had to steal money from the Marcom budget so I could have collateral and stuff like that. I had to convince, and it wasn't hard, Regis was real easy, because he was very supportive of this. Okay, and he was one of the kind of the godfathers in the background that was very supportive to me. And he gave, basically, I was able to get a dedicated person for PR to help. And that became really, really, really important because I had no money for traditional marketing. So you had to do it all through kind of PR and stuff. But basically, I use the software publishing and our focus groups to invite people from Apple to come see and watch and see how customers react. And that was the way to get people to say, hey, this is going to be a winner. Okay, so we did all that. Fast forward, made a call on name, decided, look, whatever decision we're going to make, we're going to be the muscle that was going to be doing the marketing. And whatever we decided, for good or bad, probably was going to be the name. And so desktop publishing was the name that ranked the highest by quite a bit. It felt good, and we all said, great. Paul was the one who came up with the name, and rightly, it really kind of captured it. And so it's like, great, we're going to go behind that. And so that kind of got us to the point where we're then in a position to actually, go to market. But then we had to say, okay, great, how do we go to market? And so, well, actually on the name, the deciding factor is it came down to PC publishing or desktop publishing. And I was scared to death of doing PC publishing because I didn't want to have what happened to the Apple II happen again to desktop publishing, to the Macintosh and the Macintosh desktop publishing. I knew we couldn't call it Mac desktop publishing or Mac publishing because it needed to be an industry. But I didn't want to let the IBM PC come in and steal that from us. So desktop neutered that idea, and we felt that we had a strong enough advantage architecturally from a platform that we at least had 2 years advantage over Windows and what the PC was going to do anyway. And so if we could do it and do it fast, we could establish and we could build the category and we could establish ourselves as the dominant player in it, we were going to be fine. Okay, so everybody convinced, okay, we all ready, go. Now, I had a bunch of people tell me I was an idiot, okay? Jean-Louis told me this is the stupidest idea he'd ever heard. That's not what Apple does. Sorry, Jean-Louis, if you see this. He said, well, he just said this is stupid. We don't do these vertical type of solutions. We are Apple. We do wheels for the mind. This is a general purpose. And I said, I respectfully disagree. I think we have a $12,000 solution of 2 Macs and a LaserWriter, and if you sell it as the Office, it's just a very expensive, shared printer, and that's not going to work. Here we have something where we can really do something special. And the only way I could convince ultimately others is I had to sell it as it was a Trojan horse for us to get the Macintosh into business by using this killer app that we didn't call it killer app, I forget what, but this special application that we could do that nobody else was going to be able to touch us. And so the Trojan horse idea people really liked, and that resonated at the exec staff level. And, you know, that at least gave me enough to where I could go. And so throughout this, you'll see cases where it's good to have guys like, you know, Scully was always he was quite supportive. Anytime I needed him to give a talk at a conference, and I do it periodically to keep him engaged. And so I'd get him to come keynote, you know, at Seabold or at some of the other, the Macworld conferences. Those were our two, Seabold for us, and then Desktop Publishing Conference later, and then the Macworld. And by getting him to be the speaker instead of me, you know, kept him engaged because I needed to keep the resources. So you had to be fairly, you know, thoughtful about the way you leverage the whole organization, because not everybody thought this was the right thing to do, at least in phase one. And so phase one, we said, great. We put together a training program with the assistance of folks at Adobe and Aldus. I mean, I remember we were going on this, we did this, Paul mentioned we decided we're going to go after about 150 to 250 of the top dealers. We had two teams. I led one, Paul led the other. A consultant that I had hired, a guy named Mike Solomon, because I wanted to make sure there's someone who really knew our channel real well. I put him on the team with Paul. Paul later hired him to be head of sales and marketing. And so Paul was there, and I think, Liz, you were either on their team or my team. I get it mixed up. You were on mine, and then Clint Nagy, I think Clint was on Paul's team. And then Jennifer Seaman from Aldus was on mine. So we had two teams. We went around the country, 5 cities each over a week, or 6 cities, I forget, and trained, you know, spent a day in each and just trained up guys, made it kind of exclusive. Only the top guys could come, and that kind of got it. And it turned out to be a great way to launch it into the dealer channel. And that started, you know, us off and running.
These are the dealers.
These are at that point, Apple only sold through dealers. So we were reliant, well, we had a national accounts, but we mainly, you know, our bread and butter was selling our computers through dealers, and our dealers wanted to know which software we supported and we wanted. And so we knew that when we put our imprimatur of Aldus is the right way to go, all of a sudden they all knew they needed to start stocking and selling Aldus, you know, and then we became kind of, you know, they were always looking for us to say this is the one that we were going to get behind, because then they knew we were going to support it from a marketing and sales.
This was the concept of how to sell the Mac by convincing them to sell the software.
It was a way to sell what was known as a desktop publishing system, which is generally, we always thought of it as 2 Macs, a LaserWriter, and the appropriate software. Normally it's two PageMakers, or at least one, but normally 2, you know, and MacWrite and, you know, others. And over time, other types of software would
And
come
how
along.
big was the package? You said 12,000?
It ended up being about 12,000 to begin with. My goal was from a pricing, is I wanted to get the LaserWriter down. At that point, LaserWriter was almost $7,000. You know, the Mac was $2,400 each, $5,000. The software's another $1,000. I mean, that's what.
What was Apple getting out of that sale? They were getting the hardware and the LaserWriter.
We sold the Macs and the LaserWriter.
And the others, you got your money, but you've been prepaid, and you got your money out
Yeah,
of
it's
your
enlightened.
$495.
This is called an alliance of mutual self-interest. And, you know, we got the lion's share of the revenue, not to be confused with profits, although we did reasonably well, and over time more. But, you know, we had the distribution channel. We had we were the brawn, and we needed these guys as brain. Okay,
But the deal
and
that you
so
cut-
it worked out pretty well.
Did you have to cut a deal with them
No.
financially?
No, they had, it was pretty easy. They needed us, we needed them. You know, here we were already in, we were in product together, right? I mean, they were every LaserWriter, so we were already in bed, and we just needed to have a solution.
What he's not, our relationship with Apple, not with John, but with Apple was poisoned, okay? Because Steve Jobs was shown out the door, and Jean-Louis Gassée came in. And he was basically hostile to anything Steve believed in. Would you agree with that?
Not everything. Not everything. Not everything. I'll give him credit for, he was really good. He's a good leader, and you can probably speak. He's a good leader, but his leading style is us versus them. And you're either part of the us or you're part of the them. And so, you know, it depends on where you were on which side of that.
Well,
if you're on the us
with-
side, you know,
with-
it's different than if you're on the
With
them side.
with us, the relationship was very difficult. They sold their 20% of Adobe for, they made $70 million on that. It would be worth 10 billion, 15 billion now, but Apple doesn't need the cash.
Let's put it this way.
Just a minute.
I did not want to sell, and furthermore, I tried to convince internally that we should buy 19.9% of Aldus as part of this deal. You never knew, because I thought we're going to make these guys gazillionaires, you know, and you know we might as well participate in it.
Go ahead, John.
Well, no, it's just that we found it personally difficult to deal with Jean-Louis.
How did that affect you?
Well, we got a lot of OEMs by that time. We were starting to build the OEM channel, and we had relationships with the PC side of the business. And we always tried to maintain the relationship. We didn't have a bad relationship with John Scull. I think that was reasonably good. We had a lot of friends at Apple, so that was not a problem. Jean-Louis, not so much. Over time, we stayed with Apple through all the way until Steve came back, and that was a difficult journey.
I can add one.
I would probably, you know, I think if I shifted a little bit, you know, and I'll touch on the alliance, and at some point, the alliance of the companies got a little strained, and that was, and let me save that and talk a little bit about that.
Let me ask you a question. How good was the LaserWriter?
That was the best thing out there. It was better than the alternative. No. You're correct.
Well, when do the competitors come
Yeah,
out with
that's what I
that?
mean.
Pardon me?
There really wasn't a meaningful competitor in the marketplace for 3 years. You know, you had us, and then I always like to pitch it. You had us, and then Data Products was supposed to be working on a 600 dot per inch, you know, higher end, expensive one, and then you had the Linotype, which was the ultimate, in that you had this nice, you know, kind of way that you could always scale up, and so that's the beauty of PostScript. The beauty of PostScript is that.
Butler, go on. Butler. Gentlemen,
Yeah, it was much later, because we're talking about what I'm talking about is the formative years, which was 85, 86, 87, 88. Okay? After that, in 89, the world, from what I could tell, now, mind you, I left at the end of 88, and so to pursue other pastures, and you know, it seemed like it was right at the point where things were starting to get a little more challenging. But by then, it was $1 billion business for Apple, right? I mean, this was a big deal. We were the tail, desktop publishing was the tail that was wagging the dog at Apple, you know. And unfortunately, for good or bad, you know, it became very mainstream at Apple, and everybody then was watching it, you know, so everybody had an opinion on everything I was doing, you know, and I went from kind of having me and my small little band, you know, of 2 or 3 folks, and then a key person, and I had people working that I worked with. They didn't work for me on the LaserWriter team, an evangelist dedicated to me, a PR person, a Marcom person. It was a small, really fun thing. And then all of a sudden became, oh, you know, if you guys screw up, it could really hurt Apple. And it's like everybody wanted to have their opinion, you know. So it started to get a little less fun. you know, at the same time, I also got pretty excited by multimedia, which I thought was going to be the next cool, neat thing, and I like new things.
Were you measured separately? Did you have your own profit and loss?
I created one just for my own. Essentially, I created a P&L.
Your
for
P&L?
the way I saw it and the way, because I was part of the, you know, any kind of forecasting for the LaserWriter, I gave them the forecast from the marketing standpoint.
Did your P&L include the sale of the Macs as well as the sale of the
Yeah,
LaserWriter?
yeah.
So it was the whole package?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's the only way to think about it, because that's what we were essentially doing.
Chuck Geschke was next.
Just to illustrate how difficult things became after Steve left, not many people know this, but Steve actually negotiated that Apple would have the rights to display PostScript for no extra charge. It came with the deal. We could not get it implemented on the early Macintoshes. They just didn't have the capacity to do it. But we continued to work on it ourselves. And after Steve had left, I put on a demonstration for the Apple management of display PostScript. But I didn't ask the permission of our friend Jean-Louis Gassée to do that. We did the demo, and then Jean-Louis asked me to leave the conference room in which we did it because he wanted to talk to me. And he came out, put his finger on my chest, and he said, "Don't you ever demonstrate anything to Apple management without my permission." So that's the kind of environment that we went from, where Steve and we got along really great, and just a couple years later, that's the kind of environment.
The argument was not that was Scully per se, but the next level down.
Scully was sort of out of it. Sorry, excuse me, I didn't mean it that way. I meant he was out of that contentious part.
Okay, I'm not real familiar with the numbers, but yesterday it was said that at this time that LaserWriter was being sold at cost. And I know that in 1985, 86, I had an Imagen printer in my apartment in Boston. So you didn't mention Imagen as a possibility. Was that were they charging lots more?
I think we talked, or maybe you mentioned it when that question came up. PostScript was what Steve had, you know, settled on with the team, and so they,
And
you know.
Imagen couldn't be driven by PageMaker because it was
I see.
Not
It's the firmware inside of.
it didn't have the typographic capability, it didn't have the font scaling capability,
Excuse me?
it didn't have the font scaling capability, it didn't have anything.
Did
As
it
far
have
as-
a megabyte and a half of memory, or did they
No.
do something else?
They did some, well, they may have had a megabyte, but it didn't, it was more like a Hewlett-Packard PCL.
It's more like a PCL. So,
Larry, did you have some comment you want to make here? Or?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
so if I continued, you know, Paul talked about international. International was something we, you know, I strongly believed in. I've been raised overseas my entire life. And so we, from pretty much after we did the initial launch, and we now started thinking about, okay, how do we really make sure that over the next 2 years, while we have this window of opportunity, we make sure we solidify, you know, that we're the choice. And we felt we had to do it by not only doing it in the U.S., but also doing it in every major market. So I convinced the head of international, that they needed to have a desktop publishing person in every major country. And so I got a person put in for Canada, UK, and then later France. And those were the major markets. And so we then started, I would then host each summer, I would host the international desktop team to come to, you know, Cupertino. I would invite, you know, the software guys that could really help educate, and we tried to establish whatever relationships we could to make it easier for them to be successful in each country. Aldus was by far, the two of, both Adobe and Aldus were by far, you know, the best to work with, because they, you know, were committed to supporting that, would do kind of whatever was needed to help. And so it was a terrific relationship, especially in the first, you know, 2 years. It was just, we were completely aligned. Even though we knew they were doing things with other vendors, and we knew that, you know, Paul was wanting to do Windows, and we understood it. Not that we liked it, but we understood it. You know, and that's kind of how we approached it. But by the time we got into, you know, probably 87, now we had started to see, you know, Quark was showing us their products. So I knew that there was alternatives that were pretty good coming out. And so we also wanted to make sure, just like they didn't want to be dependent on Apple, we didn't want to be dependent on you know, on PageMaker alone. So we wanted to make sure it was, you know, let a, you know, 1,000 flower bloom. You know, I was trying to convince Ventura. They said basically no. I tried Interleaf and Frame. They said, thank you very much. You can't do it on that little toy. You know, now I knew we were about to come out with the Mac 2, you know, which was our step up. You know, it had a, you know, more scalable. It had a, you know, a better screen. You know, so that started to get their attention, but it still wasn't quite ready for what they were trying to do. But we kept doing the evangelism. Quark, you know, did get there, and it became a real force. It became a real competitor to PageMaker, because it was more akin to what Ventura would have been. And while they overlapped a lot, we tried to kind of help position that one's good for, you know, the more cut and paste, shorter kind of products, while the other one was better for larger products. Because you got to keep it simple for the sales guys. They either sold just one, or if they wanted to sell two, they had to know how to position it. So you had to try and kind of help them. Remember, these are dealer sales guys. Not to be confused with, they're a step above a car salesman sometimes. I mean, these are not, you know, your national account, you know, super strong sales guys. So you had to make sure you got it simple. And, you know, the top ones were really good. We, by then, you know, kind of took it a step forward. We had 12 we had 12 field marketing specialists, and we had 12 business development managers. They're in each region in the country. And basically, even though they didn't work for me, they almost all became desktop publishing people. And I just trained them. I got these guys to train them. They're on their mailing list. They're just constantly bombarded them with education, so that we really had some really strong people in the field that just kind of helped keep the seminars going regionally, and the training of dealers, because it'd be turnover and they'd keep them trained. And so it was a pretty steady drumbeat for about 2.5 to 3 years. And that kind of helped really make sure everything worked.
We're going to bring this to
pretty
the
well.
end. So what happens at the end?
Well, at the end, and this is just the end while I'm involved, and, you know, and I can't speak beyond, you know, really 89. It's the relationship started to get a little frayed, because there was a little tension of each, you know, Adobe, you know, had their, you know, independent needs, you know. I know from product development, which is probably most of it, I think the royalty and the pricing, you know, was always a point of contention from the LaserWriter from product development. And that was always a bit of a friction, you know, that I'm sure there was some pressure there.
I can't remember the year they stopped making printers. It was during,
It was after my time, well after my time.
but the market then, because there were so many OEMs and because the Japanese came into the market, they decided to exit the market. IBM exited the market, sold it to Lexmark. So right now, the printer market.
When was that? It would have been 93, 94. I mean, it was quite a ways later before there's so many choices of PostScript printers and other type of
So
laser
that was my
printers that
question.
You didn't need that.
When did the next laser printers of this kind of quality come into the market?
They started pretty much immediately after Apple announced.
So even though they had their own, how about the use of of Windows and use of the PC? Was that simultaneous?
No.
Later?
Little later.
much later.
So that's why they had that, sort of the market to themselves for a
They
while.
did. They did.
Pretty much the whole time I
It
was
wasn't
there.
because of PostScript, it was because
The
they had
memory.
graphics.
Yeah. I mean, I'll put another little caveat. I love the guys at Xerox for two reasons. One is Xerox PARC brought all this kind of brain power into the industry. But the second is I love the fact that they bought Ventura and were aggressively marketing publishing. I personally viewed that for every dollar they spent, I got 10x of sales. Yeah, because they educated more people about publishing and they showed that there was this alternative, but then when people went to check it out, inevitably they bought a new computer because the Mac really shined, and it was like, it was the greatest thing. It was manna from heaven for a guy that had very little budget. Now, fast forward 18, 24 months, then I started having plenty of budget. You know, because by then we were a really, you know, people could see the success and it was really easy for me to get budget at that point. You know, but prior to it, I got funded, you know, Xerox funded my marketing, and then I just spent PR to convert that marketing from their spend to my conversion and using PR. So it was like jiu-jitsu marketing, and I thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened.
We're going to close this session. Jonathan, you had something?
For both John and Larry, okay? I think there's a consensus in this room that Apple would not have survived the 1980s if it wasn't for desktop publishing. Do you guys agree?
The key to the survival was that there was something that they focused on. And that doesn't mean anything that they focused on would save the company, but I wouldn't say that anybody's really thought through that I know. Well, what if they had focused on K-12, or what if they had focused on financial applications or something else that had that had the same qualities and same advantages, but
I don't know what it would have been.
I don't. Well,
we had-
we didn't know what it would have been either.
And even in retrospect, I don't see what it would have been.
In our business marketing, we had 3 groups. I became one of the groups, and, you know, it was an effort to try to find some other, you know, kind of killer app areas, and we didn't quite get there yet. It took a while longer. Eventually, some of the other areas, because, you know, Excel wasn't even out yet on the Mac during that point. So we really, in the mainstream business, we just weren't there yet.
After you left, there were 2 other billion-dollar markets that grew. One was education,
Correct.
and the other was science and engineering.
Yes, and so education, we were always really strong in university side. And that, because that was a core market that, you know, Steve and Daniel Lewin had launched. When we launched the Macintosh, we had the Apple University Consortium, top 24 universities that were already seeded with it. So we got deeply embedded in the computer science and other parts. So we had a pretty strong place in the university, and then that expanded to more. We had a great internal fight about K-12. In fact, and that continued for at least 2 or 3 years. Even as I was leaving Apple, they were just then starting to allow the Mac to go into K-12, because it's pretty clear we were about to get blown out by the PC, or we were getting blown out by the PC, and we had to do it. And so, but the science and engineering only came a little later.
Let's stay with desktop publishing. This is wonderful, an Apple story. It is not where we were. Anything else about desktop publishing? I'm going to go with Martin.
I have a question. I think desktop publishing was one of the first big areas where the computers reached the workplace of non-technical people, like artists, designers. And what role played Apple Design to reach that user group?
You know, I mean, if you know Steve or known anything about Steve, Steve had a very incredible aesthetic sense.
That's
And
exactly what I was going to say.
He valued that highly in everything. not just the computer and the software, but everything. You know, the art on the wall, the Steinway piano in our lobby. I mean, he pretty much wanted to make sure that that aesthetic carried through. And, you know, and I think even if you look at Chiat Day, the ad agency, and then BBDO that took over after that, they were chosen because they got it from that standpoint. Clean, you know, then if you go into our creative services, which I probably am remiss not including them as part of the focus kind of testing that for me early on, we had just world-class designers in our creative service people, Clement Mock, Hugh Dubberly, and Tom Suter, et cetera. I mean, these are world-class, and they really deeply, you know, understood desktop publishing and kind of understood how the Mac fit, and they were very thought leaders in their community as well, and they knew others, and so it was really, really helpful to have that. And, you know, then obviously, you know, John and, you know, Liz, these guys, they understand and value, and you know, Paul has that deep aesthetic sensibility that carried over through everything. And the Mac was just an easy way to, you know, it was approachable. You didn't have to be a left-brain person to do it. You could be a right-brain person and understand graphical user interface and how it worked and stuff like that. So it was just approachable.
we could go on indefinitely about this. We have others we need to cover, and I'd like to take a break now for our coffee break.